Then the next question is a long one, but that's because I've kind of mushed together 4 questions, all of which are from various segments of the Stanford, and all of which address the overall question of the replacing of the Federal Reserve with a national bank and how it would function. Your question begins by saying, Mr. LaRouche, as you may know, on July 9th, with reference to proposals for an audit of the Fed, Professor James Galbraith gave testimony in which he went through the history of some of the constitutional questions involved. And he pointed out that the constitutionality of the Fed was actually challenged by the chairman of the Financial Services Committee in the 1970s, Congressman Henry Royce. The issue that Royce posed back then was whether the voting status of the Federal Reserve Bank presidents on the Federal Open Market Committee violated the appointment clause of the Constitution. But unfortunately, neither Royce nor Senator Regal, who brought the lawsuit, could establish standing. And ultimately, several years later, when Senator Baucus, and I actually didn't know that he did this, when Senator Baucus did establish standing in a similar case, the Supreme Court denied cert in the matter. So the issue was never tested in court. Nevertheless, it was Professor Galbraith's opinion that Royce was right on the merits, that the FOMC is a constitutional anomaly whose voting members are not duly constituted officers of the U.S. as the Constitution requires. Now, during the past year, this same Fed has flooded the streets of America with money, distributing trillions of dollars to banks, financial markets, and commercial interests, all supposedly in an attempt to revive the credit system and get the economy going. As a result, the awesome authority that this strange institution has suddenly become visible to many ordinary Americans for the very first time. People, and in some cases even politicians, are shocked, confused, and angered by what they see. And they're starting to ask some questions for which they're not getting satisfactory answers. Like, where did the Fed get all the money it's handing out? Answer, basically they printed it out of thin air. Question, who told the Fed governors they could do this? Answer, nobody. Not Congress or the president. The Fed alone among government agencies does not submit its budget to Congress for authorization and appropriation. It raises its own money and sets its own priorities. Going through this, we concluded that this might be a good time to dismantle the Fed. You can call it what you want, democratizing the Fed, tearing down the Fed, or simply creating in its place a national bank that actually is accountable to the public, but more importantly, accountable to the general welfare of the nation. The obstacles to this are obviously formidable. Tampering with the Fed is politically taboo, but the current crisis has demonstrated that the present arrangement no longer works, if in fact it ever did, for the public interest. From our standpoint, a reconstituted Fed can be called whatever you want to call it, and it could even have presidentially appointed governors confirmed by Congress. But we would demand that it submit to the usual standards of transparency, public scrutiny, etc., but far more importantly, that it would be directed to concentrate on one simple purpose, and that is making monetary policy and controlling credit expansion to produce economic growth and stable money. This would give according to our deliberations, it would give Congress an opening to reclaim their authority in this important matter. It may sound far-fetched, and there is no question that some will scream that this is a recipe for inflationary disaster. But from our studies, this is what the Constitution prescribes. Quote, "The Congress shall have the power to coin money and regulate the value thereof." It does not grant that power to the President, to the Treasury Secretary, and certainly not to a central bank. During the course of your last webcast, someone brought up the question of the greenbacks that Abraham Lincoln printed to fight the Civil War. I was appalled to see an article in the Wall Street Journal the following week that said that essentially what Bernanke was doing was using the Fed's money creation power in the same way that Lincoln did. Let me just clarify this and make sure we all agree. Lincoln was faced with rising costs and shrinking revenues because of the war. The president, under those conditions, authorized the issuance of a national currency, the greenback, that had no backing in gold reserves, and therefore outraged orthodox thinking at the time. But the fact is that the greenbacks worked. They expanded the money supply. The expanded money supply paid for the war mobilization, and it kept the economy going. Lincoln won the war by relying on, quote, "the full faith and credit of the people." That's not what Bernanke is doing. If Congress chooses to take charge of its constitutional duty, it could similarly use greenback currency, created by the Federal Reserve if you want, as a legitimate channel for financing important public projects, like sorely needed improvements in the nation's infrastructure. This has to be done carefully and responsibly, and presumably these greenbacks, if you will, would be used only for projects that truly benefit the entire nation. But here's an example as we envision it of how it would work, and we want your opinion on whether this is in line with what you're saying. President Obama has announced his goal of building a high-speed rail system. And of course, the United States is the only advanced sector country that doesn't have one. The trouble is that Obama only budgeted $8 billion for the project. Spain, by comparison, has commissioned more than $100 billion to its 15-year railroad building project. So given the vast shortcomings in U.S. infrastructure overall, it doesn't take a genius to figure out that we will never catch up with the backlog through this kind of taxing and borrowing. Our proposal is that Congress should create a standalone development fund for long-term capital investment projects. This would require the long-sought reform of the federal budget, which makes no distinction between current operating spending and long-term investment. The Fed would continue to create money only as needed by the physical economy. What that means is instead of injecting this money into the banking system, it would go directly to the capital investment fund, earmarked by Congress for special projects of great urgency. The idea of direct financing for infrastructure has been proposed before. Ironically, Transportation Secretary Ray LaHood co-sponsored legislation along these lines 10 years ago when he was a Republican congressman from Illinois. Therefore, instead of borrowing the money, for instance, to pay for the new rail system, the government financing would draw on the public's money creation process, just as Lincoln did. The bankers will howl for good reason. They obviously profit enormously from the present system, and they share in the money creation process. And then he goes into this whole big discussion of how that works. He says the direct financing approach that we are proposing would not halt the banking industry's role in allocating new credit, since the newly created money would still wind up in banks as deposits, but the government would now decide how to allocate new credit to preferred public projects, rather than let private banks make all the decisions for us, which is happening now. Congress is a human institution, and it is unquestionably fallible. Yes, mistakes will be made, but and we considered that in making this proposal, but also in making this proposal, we also asked the question, could they possibly do any worse than these guys have done thus far? Is this thinking in line with what you are proposing? And if it's not, would you please correct us?
Well, first of all, I think we're going to have to recognize that the Federal Reserve System is, by any appropriate approach, bankrupt. It is a private corporation which was created, unfortunately, by the U.S. government, in a certain manner of speaking, under Woodrow Wilson. It is bankrupt. Who is going to pay those debts? All this money issued is a debt. All this utterance is a debt. Who is supposed to pay? Who contracted to pay that debt? I know that the Federal Reserve System is bankrupt. It covers up for its bankruptcy by printing money. This reminds me of Germany in the 1923, doesn't it? No, therefore, look, the point is, the United States has to have the guts to declare the Federal Reserve System bankrupt. That's the way to get at it. It is bankrupt. And let it prove that it has assets to cover this utterance. If not, we put it into bankruptcy. What we do is we simply get rid of it by bankruptcy. Just take it off the books. It's bankrupt. It took itself off the books by going bankrupt. Easiest way of skinning that cat. Right, now, then what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to develop the third national bank of the United States. And what we will do with that is it is essentially assigned to the Treasury, but it's not an extension of the Treasury otherwise. It has a relationship to the Treasury by being authorized. But a third national bank, exactly as Hamilton prescribed in the first national bank. And we will take a little carefully guarded barbed wire, etc. thing down to the basement of the Third National Bank, and inside will be the remains of the Federal Reserve System, held in captivity for purposes of audit only. And that's the way to get rid of it, because we have to manage. You see, we have to manage the relationship which the Federal Reserve System is established with the chartered banks of the states and the national banks. We have to rescue those. Now, we're going to do that, by a Glass-Steagall kind of cleanup act of all these banks. We're going to have to create credit to keep these banks, many of which are bankrupt, but are essential to communities, functioning. We're going to have to use these banks as a way of saving them, as a way of generating the distribution of credit to maintain an economic recovery. Now, we have then this private-public relationship. And how do we deal with that? And also with international accounts. We deal with that through a national bank. So we use the national bank as a facility to promote things. Now, what we also need are projects conceived like in the form of the Tennessee Valley Authority. Now, that's an ideal thing because it had a primary purpose, but it also had a lot of other things that went with it to fulfill its primary purpose. So what we need is a national transportation development under some name, which essentially takes care of this railroad maglev system and takes care, as the Tennessee Valley did, of all the things which are auxiliary to that system. For example, I had conceptions back in my old consulting days, back in the 1950s, on the reorganization of the Pennsylvania and New York Central Railroad. They were going to be merged in a crazy way, and I've got my all heated up over that thing, and wanted to merge them in a way which would take the part of the old B&O system of the whole area in Jersey, and realized we had a problem of getting transportation from New York area to Chicago overnight. And the problem was the train could do it much more effectively and cheaply, but you had to sort the thing out. The classification problem, management problem was great. So I wanted to pick up the what was then the auxiliary services to make sure, because we could organize efficiently through warehousing and other devices in the, say, the northern Jersey area, which was a pivot then. Remember, New York City's problem was the fact that it was deindustrialized. New York City died because it did not have the revenues to carry itself in its operation because it was deindustrialized. So if we reindustrialize the area and say we don't have to have smoke all over the place, we don't have to filth all over the place, we can use now new modern technologies like nuclear technology, and we can have take the New York area and keep the people who are industrially skilled in that, industries in that, instead of having just plain poor people working through garbage piles. We have something that functions. But we need a transportation system which will assist that. We have to recognize the reason that you couldn't get to Chicago from New York was because of this handling problem. So if you dealt with that problem, you could then easily get from Chicago to New York and New York to Chicago more cheaply by rail, improved rail, than you could by truck. The truck thing was a menace. And a long-haul truck is a waste of time. You drive people more and more cheaply. They die at the wheel, or whatever. It's crazy, the trucking system. It's insane. We need a national transportation system which is oriented to an agro-industrial mission. We need to get a situation nationally so that we don't have super industries. Look, in this area, for example, people commute into the Washington area for 2 hours, 2 hours and a half each way under traffic conditions. This is insane because we reconcentrated employment in such a way as to create this condition. Under normal conditions in the United States, in the 20th century, your commuting time was to and from work was about 15 minutes, at most half an hour. We now have 2 hours, 2.5 hours in this area, and similar things in other areas. The effect of that on family life is monstrous, particularly when you have two members of the adult members of the household are maintaining a family with children. What the hell is the result of having 2.5 hours of transport each way every day? Are you human? We destroyed the entire development of the western United States. We concentrated everything in a few areas. We congested them with automobile traffic instead of efficient mass transportation systems. We should have decentralized. We shouldn't have built such big, giant, oversized corporations. We should have built smaller units distributed in various parts of the country in the rational way we used to approach this. So we need a national development program which is based on this function of transportation, which means it means also building the water system, the Nawapa water system, and other things, because we have a real problem with water supplies in the western states. We're going to have a food supply problem. We're destroying agriculture. We're destroying the industrial-agricultural relationship with the globalization and other kinds of insanity. So what we need for this period is national mission orientations of the type that Roosevelt used and Wallace used, Henry Wallace used. We know those kind of approaches to take the infrastructure development of the nation, thinking of it as a living economy, and thinking about it as a place where people live and work and have homes and have schools and have medical facilities, and think of that and say we need a national transportation reorganization plan for the United States. We have a vast territory, relatively speaking, and we should just go back and develop it. And the way to do it is start with your transportation grid, knowing where you're going, and the transportation grid is coupled with your water problem, the water management problem, both for traffic and for water management, and building up the aquifers, an area where they're being destroyed, and taking advantage of that. Forestation instead of greenie. A tree is worth much more than grass. A tree has, up to 10% of the solar radiation used by a tree is incorporated in the tree. Grass, 1-2%. So you want to have more trees, you want to have a reforestation program for areas, you want a development territory. All of this comes under the question of transportation. And we need probably a national transportation project, like a national space program or an international space program. And these kinds of programs will drive us as long as we have a future orientation in the direction we want to go in. We have to think about 2 generations from now. What are your young guys, what are your grandchildren going to look like? What kind of life are they going to have? Who's going to get to Mars first? And who's going to be able to get back?